My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture sponsored by the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. This is part 2 of a lecture called The Destiny of Freedom from Kant to Heidegger. For those of you who were here Monday, Professor Nonet led us through the close connection / identity between Kant's idea of the goodwill as the essence of duty, the will to will as freedom, which then morphs into Friedrich Nietzsche's the will as will to power. And he will, I think, review that briefly at the beginning of the lecture and then move us on to his discussion of Heidegger. Once again, Professor Nonet has a law degree from the University of Liège, and then a PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught for many years in the jurisprudence and social policy program at Berkeley, where he was my Dr. Fata, my advisor. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome again Professor Philippe Nonet.
Well, I was planning myself to review briefly the steps through which we went last week in studying the idea of the will to will and showing that in it lies the root of the sway of modern technique over our world. We concluded with a question. If the destiny of man in modern times becomes that of laboring, that is, if labor becomes universal, then we are put before this phenomenon that Max Weber calls die herrenlose Sklaverei, the phenomenon of a slavery where there is no master. And the question arises, to what or to whom does this servitude obey? So far so good. Max Weber himself never answers that question. One answer to it, and so far the only answer known to mankind, is to be found in the thinking of Martin Heidegger. It says, the authority to which modern man has fallen into servitude is that of a law. But a law of a distinct kind, for which we have no name in English. English is very poor in its power to speak of law. It has one word, law, and is unable, therefore, to differentiate between different kinds of laws. German has greater resources in that respect. Heidegger calls the law that governs in the sway of technique das Gestell. The word is untranslatable. It is explicable, maybe, but not translatable. You can see that it is a formation of the passive participle of the verb stellen. It is formed from gestellt. Stellen means to put, to pose, to set in place. That will do for the time being. This law, as compared with laws to which we are more accustomed to think, is extraordinarily imperious. It is indeed a higher law, higher than ordinary positive law. It is a higher law to which all other law must conform. It compels, for example, all legal thinking to transform itself into the calculation of policy. Those who have read recent literature about law will be familiar with that. It does not merely guide man, rather, it summons. Stellen, in one of its senses, is to summon. It summons mankind to summon nature, and that includes man insofar as he belongs to nature, to release energy for accumulation and to be made ready for disposal. Disposing in German is bestellen. So two different senses of stellen. Bestellen, to dispose, and stellen, to summon. The kinship between these words is not explicable in English. Thus, insofar as it extends to the summoning of man, it threatens to transform man himself into a disposable resource. Disposable is bestellbar. We are all familiar with the fact that all modern organizations, at least in this country, in the English-speaking world, have a department concerning human resources. We have become human resources, period. But at the same time, as it reduces man to servitude, this law misrepresents technique. To misrepresent in German is verstellen. Third formation of stellen. All of this is included in the concept of Gestell. It misrepresents technique as an instrument in the hands of man, by means of which man enlarges his power, the power of his will, and elevates himself to lordship over the earth. Thus it induces the metaphysical illusion of technique as promising freedom and progress through science. Imperious and deceptive as it may be, the law by virtue of which technique rules over modern man does not issue from will at all, be it the will of God or the will of man. There used to be a higher law that was the will of God, to which the will of man had to defer. The law, the higher law of which we speak as Gestell, is not the product of the will even of a God. It is no positive law at all. It is not a law that is posed. From where, or from which, or from what does Gestell proceed then? Answer: from nowhere, from no one, and from nothing. Das Gestell can be traced to no being, kein Seiendes, no ground. It is a groundless explosion of groundless grounding. It is the most extreme irrationality of rationality. But nothing, as it is used here, is not nothing in the negative sense. Nothing, as Heidegger says, is the veil of being, der Schleier des Seins. Being, das Sein, shows itself in das Gestell, in its imperiousness as well as in its deceptiveness. Heidegger's thinking owes its depth to this insight that sets it apart from all attempts at causal explanations of modernity. It is rooted in Heidegger's profound experience of something which is indeed exceedingly difficult to translate, but I shall put it on the board now. Die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden. Die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden. To understand this word, we have to be able to make the distinction between Sein and Seiendes, between the gerund, the infinitive, which functions on gerund, and the participle, which functions as a noun. To complete the translation, this refers to the abandonment of das Seiende, what is, by being. The implicit thought is that things, as we know them under the sphere of technique, have in some sense been robbed of their being. Let's explain that further. Under the spell of das Gestell, we have already examined that briefly on Monday, all beings are reduced to disposable and fungible quantities of energy. In Kant and Nietzsche, already in Descartes, all things are reduced to the standing of objects, objects of scientific and technical investigation. With technique, even objects dissolve. They turn into disposable Bestand. I don't know how to translate that either. One can only say that Bestand is here used to signify the being of things that are bestellt. They become interchangeable quantities of values. Things are thus robbed of their being, Sein. They finally become the meon, that's ancient Greek for non-being, the meon to which they were destined already by Plato. Things are uprooted from their formerly essential relations to man and to God, to sky and to earth, to past and to future. They become, in other words, worldless, if world is meant here as the opening of the openness of essential differences. That is, things become truthless in a sense of truth that is yet to be accounted for. in proportion as things cease to be, man experiences a corresponding impoverishment of his own existence. This is manifest in what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world, but he could not understand it being stuck within the boundaries of social science. This disenchantment is the loss of all capacity to marvel, to wonder, to reveal, to admire. Hence the fall of modern mankind into godlessness and into artlessness, and the corresponding debasement of language. This impoverishment of the existence of man shows itself in the massive experience of boredom from which modern man suffers to no end. Modern man needs always to be somewhere other than where he is. We are familiar with modern man's addiction to the screen of movies, the screen of TV, the screen that we carry now in these portable little gadgets with which we cannot dispense, it seems. We are familiar also with all the gadgets by which we listen to things other than those that we could hear if we opened our ears to what is here now. We have an earphone in our head which blasts barbarian noise into our mind. And we are caught up all the time in a feverish need for stimulation, entertainment, novelty, and so forth. The ground of all this is the boredom we experience because of die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden, the abandonment of beings by being. But this Seinsverlassenheit is at bottom nothing only to bemoan or to regard as negative. Das Gestell is in fact the first appearance, in disguise to be sure, of the law in the sense of Gesetz, of the mutual belonging of me being, Sein, and man. The law of the mutual belonging of being and man. Heidegger calls that law das Ereignis. Another word which is untranslatable. It is that by virtue of which being owns man and man owns being. They belong to one another. To be owned in German is eignen, from which the word Eignis comes. Das Gestell, says Heidegger, is the veil of das Ereignis. This is shown by all three features of it that we have so far outlined. The imperiousness of das Gestell shows how being lays a claim upon the service of man. It demands that man attend to the unconcealment of beings, to their revelation, their making manifest, to the unconcealment of beings in the openness of the truth of being, die Wahrheit des Seins, understood as aletheia. I'll just write it. Aletheia. Aletheia means unconcealedness. It is also called by Heidegger die Lichtung des Seins, that is, the clearing of being. Technique is, at bottom, a mode of such unconcealment, a mode of the revelation, the making manifest of things under a certain aspect, to be sure. Second, the deceptiveness of das Gestell reveals how being denies itself unconcealment in its own truth. Shall I repeat that? Being denies itself unconcealment in its own truth. It remains, therefore, hidden, concealed. And by virtue of its concealment, it can send man on the pursuit of misleading metaphysical representations of its essence. The truth of being, Sein, therefore entails the unconcealment of its concealment. This concealment always runs the risk of inducing man's oblivion of being, and thus furthering distortions of man's own essence as the being who speaks and uncovers beings in speech. Third, being's abandonment of beings, das die Seinsverlassenheit des Seienden, reveals how man's own flourishing depends upon the richness of the world he inhabits, and thus upon the care with which he serves the truth of being, aletheia, unconcealment. This service of truth is no servitude, though it is service. Das Gestell brings servitude only because it is exclusive of so many other ways of unconcealment other than the unconcealment of disposable energy. Because of its exclusiveness, it distorts and threatens the essence of man. Technique is in fact only one mode of the unconcealment of beings. Thus, the service of truth is no servitude. On the contrary, as we shall see, and this is the last key point to be made tonight, the service of truth is nothing other than the service of freedom. To be free, Heidegger says, is to belong in the property of beings, das Eigentum des Seins. Das Eigentum des Seins, the property of being, in the sense of das Sein, is the truth as clearing of the concealment of being. Okay? The truth as clearing of the concealment of being. Kant already knew the identity between freedom and truth. You will see it in his demonstration of the existence of freedom in the 3rd chapter of the Grundlegung. Indeed, he thought of thinking in its essence as willing. Therefore, he thought of truth, which is an attribute of thinking in his mind, is identical with freedom, which he thinks of as an attribute of the will. Since the will is the same as thought, it follows that truth and freedom are the same as well. Kant, therefore, remained committed to the traditional concept of truth as an attribute of thought. The attribute of thought that truth refers to in traditional metaphysics since Aristotle is in Latin, the adequatio intellectus ad rem. That is the accordance of thought with things. Now Heidegger points out that the agreement of thought and thing presupposes a prior disclosure of beings, das Seiende, in the openness of the unconcealment of being. Therefore, the openness of the unconcealment of being is a more fundamental kind of truth than truth as an attribute of thought, its accordance with things. The accordance of thought with things is a derivative form of truth. In the disclosure of beings in the openness of the unconcealment of being lies the ground of both truth and freedom. To free, in its original sense, is to save. It is what the victor in a war does in its generosity, in his generosity, insofar as indeed he has generosity. To free is to save, and that is to let the being who is freed simply be, in accordance with its own way to be. Right? To free is to let a being be in accordance with its own way to be. The essence of freedom, therefore, and here I quote Heidegger, is the capacity to free. It is from the capacity to free that springs the freeing of anything. Of all beings, Seiende, man alone was granted the capacity to let be, the capacity to free, to let himself be, and to let all other beings other than himself as well be. This capacity to let be is, of course, always dependent upon the simultaneous gift of being, das Sein, something over which man has no power. Right? My capacity to let be depends upon the simultaneous gift of being. Therefore, I depend in my humanity upon the gift of being. That is the other sense of the relation between being and man. We have focused so far on the other direction of that relation. Man, therefore, alone is charged with the guardianship of the openness of the clearing, that is, with the guardianship of freedom. We, you and I, each individually, are thus faced with the necessity of a decision regarding freedom. Either we remain committed to freedom in the Kantian sense of freedom of the will, and so we condemn ourselves to servitude in the exclusive service of technique, the will to master nature. Or we grasp the essence of das Gestell and surrender all thought of the absolute self-determination of the will, be it that of the individual or that of a people. We are to let go of such thoughts as autonomy, self-determination, democracy, sovereignty. All this is to be left behind, which is not to say that they cease to exist. It is to say that they lose their standing as the ultimate ground of ourselves and being as a whole. We shall then have freed ourselves to place ourselves in the service of freedom proper, as guardianship of the unconcealment of being. The destiny of freedom, which was our topic for these 2 hours, is therefore at stake in this decision. No one knows how it will be made, or when, or by whom. It may take centuries, millennia, before it happens. Nevertheless, that is the destiny of freedom, and therefore our own as well, insofar as freedom, as the capacity to free, belongs uniquely to us. I have said all I had planned to say, and Roger will preside over the questions.
Thank you, Philippe. In the back, Anastasia.
Yeah. I was wondering how
Can you stand up so we can hear you?
I was wondering what the relation between the clearing in our time of technique is, if there's like even a possibility to approach something as it is in a time where we are overpowering the beings. Like, is there a way we can enter the clearing in an age of technique?
Well, there could not be technique unless you already belonged in the clearing, because technique itself is a mode of unconcealment. It is, to be sure, a mode of unconcealment which at the same time impoverishes the being of the thing. Nevertheless, insofar as it is unconcealment at all, and it definitely is, it presupposes our already belonging into the clearing, and therefore already being capable of freedom.
If it's an impoverished undisclosure, then what part of the being are we actually receiving? I mean, if it's impoverished, it must not be full, or?
Well, I'll give you an easy example, which is taken from Descartes. Descartes says that what defines the being of things is extension, extendedness in space. Yes? his intention in doing this is to reduce all claims regarding the world to measurable dimensions of what is. Yes. And therefore, as he explains, this excludes all kinds of features of beings that are not measurable. Yes? This principle that only the measurable is articulated most recently by the great German physicist Max Planck. Wirklich ist nur, was messbar ist. Yeah? Actual, that is belonging to being, is only what is measurable. What is measurable, of course, shows only features of a being that lend themselves to that kind of caricature. It excludes all kinds of other features. Modern technique is grounded on precisely such a caricaturing. Yeah? Have I answered you?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thomas?
Yeah, I have 3 questions.
Yes. It's 3 questions or 3 points in one question?
There are 3, I think there are 3 different questions.
Okay, okay. Can we do them one at a time?
Sure.
Because I may not have entire confidence in my memory.
Sure. The first one is simply at the end of the talk you said that there's a necessity of a decision. And on this decision this decision is about the destiny of freedom. I think am I understanding you correctly if I say that it's not a decision that anyone makes?
A decision.
There's a necessity of a decision. Is that a
It's-
decision that any individual would or could make? And if not, what does decision mean?
I want to remove the word make from that. We use the phrase decision making as though we were fabricating decisions. That. We don't need that. We can simply say decide, decision. Yes. And if I have understood you correctly, then I shall say only each one of us can decide the destiny of freedom. You can decide it right now and let your decision govern the rest of your life.
Okay, and I understand.
Yeah?
The second question is, when you gave the 2 choices at the end, the 2 possibilities, either remaining in the Kantian understanding of the will to master nature, or the other alternative, surrendering, letting go of autonomy, democracy. But that second option, I don't see, this is again the same question from last time, but from a different direction in regard to Nietzsche. I don't see why that's different from amor fati, Nietzsche's conception of amor fati.
I have to take a minute about that. The concept of amor fati asserts implicitly the identity of freedom and necessity. Yeah?
Okay.
Which is asserted not only by Nietzsche, but also by, for example, Schelling, who is explicit about that. We didn't talk about Schelling, so I just wanted to say that the concept of amor fati is not unique to Nietzsche. It is therefore not necessarily bound to will to power, it is to be found as a consequence of the will to freedom as well, since in Schelling, at any rate, metaphysics is the doctrine of being as will and freedom as the ground of will.
But it's not necessary, and the amor part of it is not necessary. You don't have to love it.
Well, what is love?
Yeah, that's the question.
I thought the fatedness was the necessity part of that, right? Love your
Yeah,
fate.
it is. But I'm saying that what's the claim is that it's not necessary, that love of the fated part is necessary. And I'm saying that that doesn't imply a necessity. That's a decision. Could be a decision in the sense of Heidegger's sense of decision.
The classic definition of love in metaphysics is provided by Augustine. And it says that to love is to velle ut sit. To love something is to velle ut sit, is to will it to be. Yeah. To love a friend is to will that this friend be himself. This entails that we contribute to the freedom of that friend. By the way, that's why the friend is called friend. Yes? To be a friend is to be freeing. Yeah? You hear freeing is in friend? Befreiend. Yeah. Okay. Volo utis. Therefore, there is an intimate connection between love and being. Yeah. So, in a way, much of the things that I have been saying so far would be compatible with Heidegger's claim that the destiny of man is to be a servant of freedom. But from this, Heidegger removes the aspect of necessity. There is no fatalism of any kind in the thinking of Heidegger. None, not even a trace of it. So your decision to free in the sense of seeing the truth of das Gestell and learning from this that you are to give up on absolute self-determination, yes, and put yourself in the service of things is itself a free decision. That is one that is contingent upon you having freed yourself from, among other things, the sway of technique. Yeah? And freed yourself for this truth about yourself, that you are the guardian of being.
I don't want to.
You had a third one?
I would want to continue this, but.
Can I just ask a question about your answer to Thomas's question? Which
Yes.
is you said that there's no concept of fate in Heidegger.
Yeah.
And we typically translate Geschick des Seins, which would normally often be the fate of being, as the destiny of being. And I guess, and there is a sense in which the bringing of man to this choice is for Heidegger a Geschick des Seins, something sent by being. And I'm wondering...
No, he denies that.
Okay, so could you explain the way that Geschick des Seins is not is not part of a kind of fate in the Amor Fati sense?
I shall do it by way of counterposition. Yes, that's probably the most convenient. Those of you who are familiar with the thinking of Hegel, even superficially, know about the fundamental idea that there is a law of history, yeah, which determines every step of its course, and is fulfilled only in the ultimate identification of man with God and God with man. Insofar as there is a necessity to the succession of the steps by which man becomes united with God, yes, insofar as there is such a necessity, then the outcome of these transformations through which thinking must go determines in advance all the steps that have to be taken to gain it. All right. Every step, therefore, is a necessary moment in a sequence. And therefore, it may be said that Hegel is a fatalist. Yeah? Heidegger denies that there is any necessity to the sequence of the concepts of being through which the history of metaphysics goes. There is no necessity to it. There is no logical necessity, there is no empirical causal necessity. At every step, one doesn't know where one is going. And therefore, one is not guided in advance by a direction or pushed from behind by a causal system. Therefore, die Geschichte is not a form of fatalism.
Right. Yeah. Tom?
You used the word man a number of times
Yes.
in your talk.
Yeah.
I wondered, first of all, what word you were translating in Heidegger.
The word in German, just in Heidegger, is Mensch.
So not Dasein.
No. So when I use the word that, if I connect man and die Lichtung, then I will speak of Dasein. Dasein is belonging to the Lichtung. Therefore, Dasein is being free. Yeah? It's belonging to the service of truth. So I try to separate the two things and use them. English, here again, is constantly undermining our power to speak. We have in English, and in French for that matter, only one word for human being, and that is man. German, Greek, Latin all have two words. One which designates humanity in general, namely Mensch, or in Greek, anthropos, or in Latin, homo, and another one which designates the being of the male man. That is in Greek, aller, in Latin, vir, in German, man. We can't do that in English. So the way out of this is to remember that woman is man, even in English. Woman is a man who is born. Therefore, woman is man. Yes? or I have usurped your function.
Let me just call on some people who haven't talked yet. Yes, in the middle there.
Sure, yeah. I've got 2 questions.
Yeah,
Can I do them one at a time?
one at a time. That will be helpful.
Okay, yeah. So the first one is given how we see man around us and his inclination to evil. How does this kind of directive to free things, to not impose oneself on things, not become reduced to moral apathy?
To moral apathy. I see. Well, that's a good question. To let be is not the same as simply to be indifferent, quietist, not at all. It requires a great deal of work, namely, among other things, the work of loving. Loving is letting be. Being a friend is letting be. There is no apathy, quietness, or anything of the sort in that. On the contrary, there is difficult thinking. Yeah.
Oh, but I meant apathy in terms of not in terms of indifferent.
Ah.
I meant in terms of not acting against, accepting evil.
Oh, I don't think that follows in the slightest bit. To grasp something as evil in the first place means to have let its meaning evil strike you. It takes a great deal of thought to understand what the essence of evil is, and then to recognize it when it happens.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. There is, by the way, in some of Heidegger's writings, the suggestion, just a suggestion, that perhaps the essence of evil is the will.
Okay, and there's
That is the self-assertion of the one who wills, which is a principle of the destructiveness of that someone towards the being of the things against which he asserts himself. So you see the connection? So it's just a suggestion there. Heidegger doesn't commit himself to it.
and that kind of leads to my second question.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of suggestion of the role of the will and self-assertion in evil is one of these elements, such as this Gestalt, this law.
Gestalt? Yes.
This law which comes out of nothing, and which imposes itself on all other laws, and our duty to respect it, and the goal of moral agency to enter into the order prescribed by this law. All of these elements are traditional elements of Christian theology. All of these are the moral foundations, are part of the moral foundations of Orthodox and Catholic theology. And so I'm wondering, why not see that as a third solution,
Third solution.
as
First
opposed to
two-
the Kantian self-destruction and this Heideggerian freedom?
You have asserted something which I think is not correct, that Heidegger thinks that we must obey the law of Gestalt. On the contrary, we must grasp what Gestalt is. Once we grasp it, we see that it impoverishes our capacity to unconceive.
Or what impoverishes our capacity?
Das Gestalt.
Okay.
Therefore, the outcome of the inquiry into what das Gestalt is to set it aside. Not in such a way that technique ceases to exist, but only in the way that technique ceases to have this exclusive claim upon our thinking. I don't think that there is any trace of such thinking in Christian theology, Catholic or other.
Okay. I didn't understand everything there, so I couldn't respond to you.
Okay.
But it was just, striking how kind of many of the problems of modernity that we saw with Kant and with Heidegger have been addressed over and over the past 2,000 years by theologians. And there is
Well,
except you only have the only answer is the only difference is the answer is that in one case you try to find an answer which ultimately we have a very hard time doing and accepting, and in the other case you have the same answer over and over again. It's turned to God.
I can only answer you by defying you to show me an instance of that.
Of
I
what?
think anything that you will show me, I'll be able to demonstrate to you that it has nothing to do with the problems of which we have been speaking.
Okay, sure. I mean, it would take a bit more time.
If you want to take the challenge, Professor Berkowitz can explain to you where to write to me.
Okay, sure.
You want to ask your question now?
I'm not sure if it's just the phrasing of the claim of being, but it almost sounds like the relationship between being and man is one of techne, where, because you were saying that being lays claim upon the service of man, so what is man without this call? Like, is he just being? I mean, like, it just seems like there's like this circularity of being into techne, because it's like there's a relationship between being and man. But I think it was just the word lays claims upon that made it sound very techne.
That was meant to underscore the legal character of the unity of man and being. That is, being makes a claim upon your service. So I don't think it has any obvious relation to technique. You may want to say something more about what you thought to be the relation to technique. And the sense in which you use it. Is it the sense of Plato?
I'm not sure. I haven't read Plato. I guess where that came from is when you were saying that that a friendship is a freeing, and I'm wondering how we can enter into friendship in a time that is not technical, because how do we free something without having power over it already?
Oh, on the contrary.
Yes.
To free something or someone is to let go of power.
So to approach it without having power?
Well, it is presumably always possible for us to find a way of exerting power. It might not always succeed, but we have all kinds of means available at our disposal to exert power upon the world and upon other beings. But insofar as we are committed to letting be, and letting something be in accordance with the way it itself is, yes? We have in advance given that up. Yeah?
Yes.
So it sounds like freedom is a kind of staying one's hand. Is that?
Staying one's hand.
That's sort of like deciding not to, handle something, not to try to influence it. Is that in the right ballpark even?
Well, in some sense it is, and in some sense it isn't.
Okay.
It is if one employs influencing in the way we employ it today, which is thoroughly informed by the technical essence of our world. We want to produce effect, and producing effects is indeed employing technique in the service of our aims. Yes, that's art. Yes.
Okay.
So, but letting be is not without influence in some other sense on ourselves on the one hand, and on the beings that we let be. We let them be. Yeah, that is not nothing.
Okay. I suppose my question that I was going to ask is how do we do that without resorting to technique? Like how do we do that without sort of trying to exert power to hold ourselves back? Is that a question?
I'm not holding myself back when I love my lover. Am I? Yeah. But to love my lover is to let her be. And indeed, to hope she is truly.
Yes.
So, would you say that perhaps the way to engage with our own freedom and the freedom of our friends, our lovers, of beings is similar to Heidegger's approach to the nothing, which is to say to avoid describing it in either terms of what it is, of what the object of our gaze is, or what it is not, to avoid using that, to try to allow something outside of terms of what it is and what it is not. Would that be a way of conceptualizing, a way of allowing someone to be?
Well, it seems to me that you are almost contradicting yourself there.
It would be maybe so, but no, because you're saying what's being said is that there is a simultaneous approach of power and the restriction of power in allowing someone to be by you actively engaging in somebody's ability to be as being their friend. You both allow and engage somebody's personal beliefs or the way that they act with themselves. Would you say that is the case, or is it?
No, I have said that to let be is to save
Right.
a
And that,
being, that is to let it be in accordance with the way it itself is.
right.
Therefore, I have in advance given up on any employment of means of influencing in the sense to which we are accustomed. You speak of power, technique, and so forth as indispensable to do that. Well, no. Every employment of technique or power contradicts freedom. Yeah.
And that's what I'm thinking. It's like, so when we don't understand someone, like the way that we ask questions is an employment of technique. And so what I'm asking, which is in and of itself an employment.
Why do you say that it is an employment of technique?
Because we try to create a result. We're trying to produce an effect by understanding, are we not?
I don't think so, no.
Well, maybe you could tell us where you're getting the concept of letting it be from. Like, maybe just speak about the text.
From Heidegger.
Well, of course, from Heidegger. So in Being and Time, we get a very rich understanding of what care means, right? Care is to preserve or nurture being, right? Being that has been covered over to us from an entire history of philosophy. Or indwelling, where you get another notion: to dwell is to be, and to be alongside others, to preserve.
Yeah.
So maybe you might flesh out some of the terms of what letting something else be is. But then I also want to ask the question of what it means to have that relationship towards oneself. And that's, I think, the question of authenticity in Heidegger. So freedom towards death, right, is freedom
you have
towards...
Being in Time in English, haven't you?
Of course I have. You can tell by my accent and my vocabulary. But I mean, maybe you could say something about some of the text that he's using that some of us might be more familiar with. Yeah, and if the question of authenticity, freedom towards one's own death, letting yourself be towards your own most possibility, if that is not a kind of fated situation, if that is not exactly what Nietzsche meant when he said amor fati, to love your fate is to be authentic in Nietzsche's sense, in Heidegger's sense.
Well, if let me put it this way, since you want to speak from the language of being in time. Heidegger says, I am thrown into my being as a human being. I have nothing to do with bringing that about. Yeah. Geworfenheit, one says in German. Yes. Is that fatalism?
The thrownness?
What I am thrown into is die Lichtung des Seins. That is freedom. I couldn't be free unless I had been thrown into it, that is, into my humanity. Is that fatalism?
Well, you know what my answer is, but I'd love to hear why it isn't.
Well, I have already said that. I said there is not a trace of fatalism in Heidegger.
Yes, but that's not an argument, right? That's a statement. Why isn't there a trace of fatalism in Heidegger?
Why is there no trace of fatalism? Because Heidegger thinks that the teachings of metaphysics, on the basis of which fatalism is born, are false.
But isn't it... Oh, sorry, I just interjected. I'm just
No,
on your point.
Go
But even if he believes that the metaphysics on the basis of which fatalism was born are false, isn't it possible that he has his own conception of fatalism, which is congruent with his own theories?
Well, he denies that there is any fatalism in his own thinking. I can only say that again.
So then I guess
So there is no conception of fatalism which would include him, according to him, right? Now, it is possible that he is mistaken about that. But before you assert that Heidegger made a mistake, you would better be very careful.
Grace, did you want to finish the first part of your question?
I guess I want to know more about what's at stake as to whether freedom is fated or not. I mean, we're talking about the destiny of freedom. That language already has a notion of...
I won't accept your question. I will accept the assertion, which is grounded in the text of Being and Time, that we are thrown into being free. Being free is a burden that is cast upon us. We should think of freedom as a burden, not as a right. Nothing of that kind at all. It has already ceased to be anything like a right in Kant. Yes, of course, that still hasn't been learned in the English-speaking world. That was over 200 years ago, and still we have not heard.
In the back.
I hope I didn't misunderstand you at any point.
You're going to have to speak up, but we're not
I
going
hope I didn't misunderstand you at any point, but just out of curiosity, you said at the end of the lecture that one of our options was to surrender our self-determination of the will, and by doing that...
I didn't quite see that. I said to give up on all claims to absolute self-determination.
Okay. So sort of following that then, that would allow you to grab the essence of das Gestell? Am I understanding
Or
correctly?
rather the other way. Understanding das Gestell makes it possible for you to free yourself from any thought of absolute self-determination.
Would you say that that is allowing yourself to, I guess, allow other things to be then? That surrendering of absolute self-determination of the will?
Well, the two are obviously connected, yes.
Right. Then, as the result of sort of grasping das Gestell, are you in essence coming to love everything? If to love something is to will it to be?
No, I don't think so. No.
Just going on.
Loving everything is a thought of which a great caricature is made by Dickens somewhere. So, I don't remember where, but I remember what the caricature is. It's a caricature of someone who claims to have universal love, but who cannot possibly be kind to a neighbor. What was that?
Yeah.
I believe you said earlier that Gestalt is...
You just put a T at the end of Gish. Oh, the participant, yes.
Or, I mean, Gestalt as it is like a...
Yes.
I believe you said that it has reign over the being we've defined as God.
Has reigned over...
Like God cannot influence Gestalt.
Gestalt is fulfilled when it brings modern man to godlessness. That is, to a condition in which he cannot be moved one way or another by the divine.
I think he's talking about the fact that Gestalt is not a product of divine or human will.
I misheard
that what you
you. I
meant?
should probably come closer to you.
Yes, that's sort of my question. I was just wondering we've defined God as this all-powerful being.
No, only Christian theology, and only insofar as it is determined by metaphysics. We don't define divinity as all-powerfulness. Zeus was not all-powerful. He was very powerful, but not all-powerful.
That's because he wasn't defined as God.
Oh yes, very much so. He was called Theos, which means in Greek something like God. Not quite the same, of course.
Well, what about the God is that which is greater than that which is greater than the greatest that can be conceived, or even greater than that. The way we define God is that which is greater than that which we, like the greatest thing that we can conceive.
In metaphysics and in Christian theology, insofar as it leans upon metaphysics, you wouldn't find a trace of that in Greek thinking. Not a trace. So part of understanding das Gestell is understanding that the will cannot be an absolute good, is understanding that the metaphysical concept of gods must be left behind. All these things turn out to be the same. And therefore that Christian theology, insofar as it leans upon metaphysics, is also to be left behind. Have I answered you? I don't know. Maybe I haven't even heard the question.
Well, my Heidegger is somewhat lacking.
Oh, all right.
We have time for just one or two questions. Is there? Yeah.
Earlier, you discussed man owns being and being owns man. Could you elaborate on what that means? Is that similar at all to species being? Or is that
What was the meaning of your question?
this law you discussed earlier?
Oh, that's the rightness. Is that it?
Man owns being and being owns man.
Yes. That is, there could not be being without the being of man. Being demands to be understood as being. And only man, among all beings, has been granted the capacity to understand being, and therefore to let things be. Conversely, no man can be man without being. My humanity is entirely contingent upon the being of beings. Insofar, at any rate, as the essence of my humanity is the guardianship of the truth of being. Insofar as I fail to be the guardian of the truth of being, I cease to be human in proportion to the degree to which I fail. Yes. So therefore, there cannot be being without a belonging of being to man. And there cannot be man without a belonging of man to being. Therefore, the fundamental law that governs not only us but being is the mutual belonging of the one and the other.
I don't know, are you familiar with the term species being?
Yes.
Is that essentially what species being is saying?
No, I don't think so. No, species being is a Latin translation of a Greek idea, which is first advanced in Plato. With Plato begins the reign of metaphysics. The fight against metaphysics is first undertaken by Friedrich Nietzsche, and it is taken over then by Heidegger. Friedrich Nietzsche does not quite bring it to a successful end. Whether Heidegger does, we shall see.
Anastasia.
I'm wondering how being can throw us into being before we've asked after it. So what is this relationship of Dasaragnus before we've been able to question and try and enter even with imagination? So how does it throw without the question?
How does it grow? It is not clear that it throws, because it is not an it.
I mean,
it is nothing. Yes? Das Sein ist nichts. Though, therefore, it could not have thrown. If there was any throwing, it was the doing of your parents. Yeah? Something of the sort. Yeah.
So then what is the throw?
The throw is that you had no say in the decision that you made. Your humanity is thrown upon you.
So it's more of a thrown upon than thrown into?
It is both. We are thrown into something that becomes a burden on us, and therefore under which we find ourselves.
Okay. Yeah, great.
Philippe, I'm gonna pose a last question. We're out of time, and I'm sorry. And it comes back to something that you were discussing with this gentleman over here before, in a certain way. You talked about freeing as saving, and you've talked about freeing as letting a being be in its being. And so I want to ask about political and legal judgment in that time. And, one confronts someone, and one lets them be in their evil. And
that doesn't follow, does it?
Well, yes, we let them be evil.
We let them be evil.
Yeah, okay. I thought that's what I meant to say.
Well, but what does that mean? That means that we then understand that has to end.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that was the first. So the next step is that has to end.
But we can only say that has to end when we have let it show itself for what it is.
Okay, exactly. When we say it has to end, that is a different way of encountering the being than thinking the being of its being. It has to be somewhat of a technical approach to the being, right? Why? Okay. Why? What is it about seeing evil as evil leads to the next step that evil has to end?
That evil has to end belongs to the concept of evil. Of course, this evil has to end. Evil in general, no. Evil, were it not that evil is, there would be no good.
And that's true of but that's also true of this evil. This evil will bring about certain goods.
Oh, that's true also.
So
yes.
what is it that leads us, what is it that leads us to require, to act in such a way that this evil ceases to exist?
Well, the one who is most responsible to bring it to an end is not you.
But the evil.
Yes.
Yes, and what if they don't?
Well, then they add another evil on top of the first.
But again, part of the answer is in being in time, the call of conscience. Right? There's something that calls us to.
Let be.
Yes.
Yes.
No, that can't be it.
Well,
the idea of conscience in
calling-
Heidegger has nothing to do with ethics whatsoever, no? Except insofar as ethics includes the responsibility that we have for the guardianship of being. But that's not the way we understand it usually. So it requires a gigantic step to move from ethics to Heidegger's thinking.
But then how do you make the step in what he's asking? If we see evil, how do we then get to the next step? You've already admitted that we have to make it end.
I didn't say that we have to make it end. It has to end. That's what I said. And the one who is responsible in the first instance for ending it is whoever is responsible for the evil, right? So.
But aren't they themselves called to let themselves be?
But
It's
if they let themselves be evil, then they will let themselves be the sort of thing that has to end.
And if it has to end, isn't that a kind of fatalism?
I didn't hear. I'm sorry.
If it has to end, isn't that a kind of fatalism?
No, it is part of the concept of evil.
We have to end. Otherwise, I won't be able